noticing in the previous talk when Jerry Honert talked about the term sexy name syndrome. When it comes to beaver trappers and trail guides for the West, what name pops into your mind?
Kit Carson.
Kit Carson. That's the sexy name syndrome. Actually, Kit Carson, you know, benefited from some tremendous publicity associated with the Fremont expedition, and then his father-in-law, Senator Benton from Missouri, and then it turned into some dime novels and stuff, and it got into the public psyche. That's what we mean by sexy name syndrome. Well, I'm going to talk about a different trail guide and beaver trapper, Antoine Leroux. And it seems that if we could change the name of the journal that I edit from Desert Tracks to something else, it would have to have the name water in it, because water is where the trails went. And so it's really about finding water. And I think most of the trails here in Arizona, some of them probably still visible, especially out there on the Sentinel Plain, but some of the trails here in Arizona, my theory, this is all just my thinking, is that those trails were probably made by the mammoths. Going from waterhole to waterhole. We have a couple of them in this very valley here that mammoths were at and killed by humans with Clovis points. And it was those trails from waterhole to waterhole to waterhole made probably by the animals first. And then when man came into North America, those first Americans, hey, the trails were already there. And then they used them for 10,000 years, and then it got into the more historical period. And by historical period, we simply mean when people started writing things down in history. So with that all said, sexy name syndrome, we're not going to be talking about Kit Carson, but about Antoine Leroux. And I just wanted to tell you what I'm up to here. I'm just thrilled that there's an audience to talk to, because I'm so excited about the research that I do and the things I discover. I just want to share them with somebody. So I'm not the expert here, but it's what I enjoy doing, and I find myself frequently falling down rabbit holes of history. And it's, you know, those people that start studying and writing and stuff on this subject, you know, the first thing you do when you see a new article or publication or report is you look first at an index if there is one, and secondly you start looking at the bibliography and the endnotes or the footnotes, and once you kind of get all that figured out, you know what the book is about. And so it's following those footnote to footnote reference to this book, never heard of it, go get it, and then guess what, there's more footnotes, and that's what I mean by the rabbit holes that I keep falling down. But I have such fun doing it. You know, in the weeks that it took to put this talk together, there were probably several slides where I was working on one line on the slide, and 8 hours later, I kind of emerged thirsty from my library, and my wife's already gone to bed, and and I missed a couple of meals and that sort of thing, because I'm just having fun. And that's what all I want to do, is share some of the things that I've discovered. So I've talked to this organization before, several years ago in Wilcox, about Antoine Leroux, but this time I want to focus on one aspect of him, and that is his service as a trail guide for other expeditions. These are military and military exploring expeditions of the West. And he got into it early with 1846 with Cook. And I guess he liked that, because bingo, he's starting to get employed left and right. So with that all said, let's get rolling here because I have more slides than time to fit them in, and so you will find that I will be on some slides going very fast because otherwise we'll only get 1/3 of the way through. And secondly, because of the nature of the beast, that is, we're talking about history and historical documents, which is where we get the information, there are a few little passages that are very key that I'll want to read to you. And when you see a slide that comes up in a minute that there's words that you can't see from back there and read, it's because I'm going to read them to you, okay? And that's the only reason that they're that way. So I took all the slides out on the genealogy and the family background of Leroux. Suffice it to say his grandmother was a Spanish citizen from Taos, and in the mid-1700s she was kidnapped and taken captive by the Comanches and then traded to the Pawnees, and then a trapper from St. Louis found her, bought her, married her, took her back to St. Louis, and they ultimately got married, and then Leroux was a grandchild of that. And his father and his grandfather were both French citizens. Neither of them, as far as I can tell, ever went to Canada or had any connection with Canada. And Jerry Honert was also talking about all of these mistakes that get into the history books. Well, more than 50% of every book on the West that mentions Leroux identifies him as a French-Canadian trapper. He never went to Canada. His father never went to Canada. His grandfather never went to Canada. They came straight from France to St. Louis. He's not a French Canadian, okay? But there's mistakes all over the place, so we have to keep trying our best to get all of the evidence. Well, he was born in 1801 in St. Louis. Now, what happened about that time in St. Louis? A couple of things. What country was it in? France. Okay, so I believe it was. In fact, the next slide here tells the story. It's 1801 when Leroux was born in St. Louis. But France owned that area of the country for those years there, 1699. It went into Spanish hands for a little while. Then it came back into France for these final 3 years. And then in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. So, Leroux was born a French citizen with Spanish heritage in his family background. And when he was 2 years old, he became an American citizen by virtue of the Louisiana Purchase. All right, we'll get back to that citizenship thing as we go, but let's do the very early years here quickly. This is from a New York Times article that was actually written by Leroux. It's signed at the bottom of the article, Antoine Leroux, and it stems from a report that he gave to Congress about railroad routes. But in that report, he says, in the year 1820, when I was 19, I joined the Ashley Henry expedition up the Missouri. Well, the problem is that didn't happen in 1820, it happened in 1822. So sometimes one's memory fails a little bit, but he was one of the 100 young adventurers that went up the Missouri with the Ashley Henry expedition. And then it says, and after that, near 2 years in that part, I went to Taos. So if we correct his error from 20 to 22, and it's near 2 years later he went to Taos, it's about 1824. He likely went with the Robideau brothers. We don't know that for a fact, but they knew each other. They were buddies from growing up in school together in St. Louis, and he spent a lot of time with them during the 1820s in Taos. But very quickly he started trapping with them into Colorado, southwest Colorado, and over into Utah, eastern Utah, and all the way down into southern Utah. And for probably that middle part of the 1820s, that's what he was doing. Now, shortly after 1825, there were multiple groups of Taos trappers that came into Arizona. And there's 3 or 4 or 5 of them, and some of them list some of the names, but not all of the names that were with them. Leroux was undoubtedly with one of them, but we don't know which one. He came into Arizona, and he says this in this same article, that he'd been on generally on the waters of the great Colorado River of the West for 15 years trapping. And trapped the whole country, every river, creek, and branch of the Gila, from the Gila to the Grand River Fork of the Upper Colorado, out to the Great Salt Lake, the Wasatch Mountains, the Virgin River in northwest Arizona and southwest Utah. And I have been 4 times to California, and a guide to great many American officers, which is the theme of the talk, okay, that I'm doing right now, the guide for the officers. He spent some time in Utah. And before I get into the groups that he guided, I wanted to just put this in here because I couldn't resist. There are 2 rock inscriptions that I know of that Leroux left his name on. One in Utah, which I haven't personally seen. It's a little hard to get to. My editor partner, Dave Miller, has been there, but I haven't seen it. But some photographs were taken long ago, and that's this one here, which has obviously been chalked. This photograph was taken in 1968. It was a Polaroid picture after they chalked it. You have to float down a river and then hike up a canyon to get to the location, so it's fairly remote. But it says A.T. Leroux, 1835, which is right about the time that he was trapping in Arizona and obviously getting up into Utah also. So all around in this part of the West for 15 years, he did that. Now, this is very hard to see, but I'm going to show you some miracles in a minute with this slide. This is Independence Rock just west of Sears Point on the Gila River, west of Gila Bend. And when I went there first to Reba Granrud's second husband, Dennis, took pictures of all of the inscriptions on this rock in the 1980s and had a typescript, and there were only 2 copies in 2 libraries in Arizona. So when I went to look for it, one of them was missing from one library, and I had to go to Yuma, and I finally got a copy of it. And so I went there after a couple of attempts. I finally found the place and started looking at it. Rick Collins, who's the next speaker, had warned me that there were a lot of rattlesnakes there because he had been there, so I was worried about that, but it turned out to actually be the bees that was the problem when I went, because I climbed down from the top over the rock, and I'm not a rock climber, and I was pretty scared about an 8 or 10 foot drop and then roll down the side. And I'm climbing down it, and I'm looking in a crack, and guess what's in the crack there? The killer bees went a little crazy. Fortunately, they left me alone, and I got out of there really quick. But I went to one of the pictures that was in Dennis's 1980s report that showed a picture of L. Maxwell. He was a mountain man and came to New Mexico. He ended up having the largest land grant. At one time, he was the largest landowner in the world, and at 1.7 million acres. And I knew that he was a friend of Kit Carson and a friend of Antoine Leroux, and there is L. Maxwell. You can see, can you see the L. Maxwell? Yeah. Okay, so there it is. There's something other up here, I can't read it, but there's another inscription on that rock. Do you see it? Yeah. Well, that's in Adobe Photoshop with the contrast enhanced, the same slide. Do you see the name under L. Maxwell? There's an A, there's an L, E, R, O, U, X. You see it? Well, I stood there and I took that first picture this picture, and I didn't see the A. Leroux, but I took the picture and I went home, and then my son did the little contrast adjustment, and when I saw it, I almost didn't believe it, you know? So I actually had to go back to look at it, and guess what? It is there. I've been there 4 times back now to make sure that it's still there. But your eye goes to L. Maxwell because it stands out, and the other one is so faint you would if you just went there and didn't know what I'm telling you now, you would never see it. I didn't see it. No one else saw it. Dennis, Reva's husband, didn't see it when he wrote his report on the names on the rocks. So, but guess what? It's there, and I found it. And that was pretty cool. I guess that was in 2004. How time flies, huh? All right. Now, the citizenship of Leroux, we already talked about the fact he was born French. In St. Louis in 1801, but when he got to Taos, the Mexicans weren't too happy with the American trappers coming in, and they were kept confiscating the beaver pelts and putting them in jail and this and that and the other. But remember, his grandmother was from Taos, so the family was still there, and so they welcomed him in as a family member, and now he's like an American citizen in Mexico, northern New Mexico, and having trouble getting permits to trap. So guess what he did? Along with a whole bunch of other American trappers, they naturalized as a Mexican citizen in September of 1830, and so he's French, American, Mexican, and then by 1848, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, after we won the Mexican-American War, everyone in New Mexico automatically became an American citizen unless they declared they wished to remain a Mexican citizen, which he didn't do, so he was an American citizen again. So it was France, U.S., Mexico, U.S. All right, enough for that. So this here is just one more slide before we do the expeditions. And that is, this is a document, and the blue arrow points to the fine print at the bottom, which says Antoine Leroux as one of the 19 delegates to the Convention of Delegates for a petition to Congress to make New Mexico a territory. Okay, so he was into politics and citizenship also, and now let's just dive into the Leroux as the guide. Now, here is something that we're not going to stay on but a second, but these are the things I have found that he did as a guide. And there are 5 major expeditions, exploring expeditions. There are 5 punitive military expeditions against Indians, and a couple of other things. And so I'm just going to get off of, you want to get your picture, get it now, because I'm going to go off of this slide and go to number 1, the first big one, and we were talking about it yesterday, and it keeps coming up because of where we're at, right here on Cook's Trail, and that is Leroux became the chief guide for the Cook's Mormon Battalion trip in 1846. They were headed to California to fight the Mexican-American War. Now, actually, there were several guides with the group, and one of them was Pauline Weaver. But Pauline Weaver, I think they met him around Albuquerque, and he had some other guides with him, and when Cook first met them, they were all drunk, and he was not impressed. And the next day, Pauline Weaver got really sick and was sick for several weeks. And in the process, Leroux shows up, and they decide to hire him as the chief guide instead of Pauline Weaver. But Pauline did recover his illness and continued with them. Also, Sacagawea's son, Charbonneau, was one of the guides in the group, and there were several others. but Leroux was the chief guide. And I'm really interested in, because all of these guys, all of these military guys that hired him as a guide, how did he find that water? How did he get that? Where did he come up with this spring? He's never been here before, he said. Well, that's what I was looking at as I read all of these diaries that report on Leroux as their guide. So let's just get through this. There in general is the route of the Mormon Battalion. Of course, Leroux was picked up south of Santa Fe, and so it's this part, and where we were yesterday was right there where those Sonora, Arizona, and New Mexico comes together. We were about 5 miles from that spot. Okay. And the map that we keep promoting, and a little closer. And by the way, if you look at this up here, which is where I-10 is, towards Tucson and New Mexico border here, right there it says, believed by Mr. Leroux to be an open prairie, a good route if water can be found. Okay? And so that's why Leroux took Cook where Cook did not want to go. He wanted to go west, and he took him south. And what he was doing was trying his best to intersect with the Janos Road, which is right down here, through Guadalupe Canyon. And Leroux was going this way when Cook wanted him to go this way, but they did go this way. And nevertheless, we can't get into all of the details of that expedition because we've got another 11 expeditions to get through in just a moment or two. So let's keep going. Here's even closer to where we were, and you'll see it says the Rio Yaqui, San Bernardino. That's the ranch we were at yesterday. There's a little teepee. That means their campsite was there. And this is the pass, Guadalupe Pass and Guadalupe Canyon. Cottonwood Canyon is right up here. And then this is Blackwater Draw, which is Douglas, right by the old smelter. And then the current Mexican border runs right this way. And so parts of it here are south of the border and south of the border. And when we went to Elias Smith's grave at Ash Creek, that is right here. And then here is San Jose Mountain at Naco that we pointed out. And here is the Huachuca Mountains. The Santa Cruz Mountains are over here. Here's the San Pedro River. And right somewhere right here is where we're at right here in this hall today. Okay? So let's keep going. Here is this painting that we saw a couple of other times of the Battle of the Bulls, or Bull Run, however it is supposed to be said. And there is a closer up there. You can actually, by enlarging it a little, you can actually see some of the bulls standing here, and the attack going on is depicted in this drawing or painting. Here is another painting made from it depicting the same event. But so Leroux and Cook and everyone arrived in San Diego about mid-January 1847. This is an 1846 drawing of the mission in San Diego. And Cook had been sent forward. First, they sent Charbonneau to get some mules from San Diego and bring them back towards the desert in Yuma. And then later, Cook went to get some. So he actually made it to the city ahead of the Mormon Battalion. Now, he was there in January of 47. The bottom line, although Cook complained in his diary constantly about all of his guides and them wanting to go south instead of west and that sort of thing, he ultimately said that Leroux is one of the most famous mountain men of the West. Now, we're going to do real fast just several of these punitive expeditions, because I'm not interested in, I don't like reading about the history of the American military chasing Indians. That's just not my thing. But that's what they did, and so immediately after he got back from San Diego, there was first the Edward Newby expedition to punish the Navajos and march through July of 48. This one was actually not Leroux as the chief guide. It was Uncle Dick Wooten as the chief guide, but Leroux was also with him on that one. And they went looking for some Navajos, and then nothing much came of it. You know, because guess what? The Indians they didn't go away in one direction. They went away in 100 directions. And so there wasn't anyone to follow. And then a couple of months later, that winter, there was the Beale. Most of these expeditions are out of Fort Union in New Mexico. The Beale, this is a different Beale than the other Beale. This has got 2 L's, okay? Benjamin Lloyd Beale, a military officer led by Chief Guide Antoine Leroux. And the Arkansas Valley is in southern Colorado. And they went through Bent's Fort up to Pueblo. They had deep snow problem. You notice the dates, winter, and back to the San Luis Valley. No Apaches seen on the entire trip. So much for that one. He's getting paid for all of these, so he's in the business. And then guess what? Another one. Whittlesey, however you pronounce his name, against the Utes, the Utahs, or the Utes, for 4 days. The guides were Leroux, Lucian Maxwell, Charlie Autobes, Tom Tobin, some famous names. Left house on March 11th with 57 men, plus another 10 men from a different division. And there was one little fight. The Utes withdrew and disappeared, and that was the end of that. And 4 days later, they came back to Taos. So much for that. There's 5 of these. We're going really fast on those. And then the Mrs. White affair, and this was in November of 49 with Greer as the military officer. Leroux, along with Kit Carson, Uncle Dick Wooten, and Tom Tobin, and probably several more guides were along with this effort to rescue Mrs. White and her daughter and the nursemaid. I'm not going to go into the story. There's lots of literature out there, and a very readable one is Massacre at Point of Rocks by Doug Hawking, and I've seen it laying all around here. So if you want the story, take a look at that. Now, here's one of the major expeditions. We already did one major expedition, that was Cook. Now here's another big one, Sitgreaves. And this started on December 18th, 1851. No, excuse me, that's when it ended. I changed the slide last night, but the version that I changed it to is not the one we're using. So it's August 13th, 1851, and ending December 18th, 1851. And Leroux was the guide. He was paid $1,000, and there were a couple of people on the group, artists and scientists, who kept diaries. And so we have the Sitgreaves records, we have the Richard H. Kern record, and the Woodhouse record. And there are several books on this subject, and it's fascinating. This group went through from Santa Fe to Zuni Pueblo, and then straight across northern Arizona on the 35th parallel, i.e. Route 66, into the Mojave Desert in California, and ended up in San Diego. And notice the date, December 18th, 1851, because that leads into what he did next. So the route went basically from Zuni across northern Arizona, down the Colorado to Yuma and through the southern California desert to San Diego, 1851. And on that trip is this famous lithograph by Kern of Leroux Island in the Little Colorado River at camp number 4, and camp number 13, a week later, still on the Little Colorado River east of Flagstaff. They found the cascade of the Little Colorado River, and it looks like a pretty big waterfall. There's 2 guys standing on a rock there. You see that? Because look in this next picture. That's the rock the 2 guys were standing on. Here's an actual photograph. This photograph is by Tom Jonas. You know, and he's one of the members of this group. He's not here for this conference, but he was into reef photography. So he would take those pictures from the 19th century, and go and get in the same spot and take a modern photograph. So I just love that stuff. It's great work that he's done, and I really appreciate it. So there's the original, and there's Tom Jonas's photograph of that. And then they went over looking for water. They were without water for a day or 2 and heading toward the San Francisco Peaks, which is where Flagstaff is now. And Leroux was the guy with the eye. He would stand in the camp and look 20 or 30 or 40 miles over there. And I'll describe this as described in another diary in a minute. But basically he would say, "It's over there. There's the water. I'm heading out." And he would go ahead of the group and find the water hole. Well, he found a spring there that was later named Leroux Spring, or Springs. And they were there in October of 1851, and they stayed a couple of days because it was a nice valley and good water. And I went there 161 years later, and that's me sitting on. Now the Forest Service, you know, everybody feels like they must, quote, develop a spring, you know, and so they developed it, and it keeps the animals from pooping in it. And there is the modern, here's the lid that's got a lock on it, and it was a retired Forest Service guy who took me there, and he still had the key. And so we got into the spring, and I enjoyed the day immensely. Here's another picture or 2 of it. That's me looking down into the water. You can see the light on my camera. And I'm taking a drink. And then in downtown Flagstaff, I noticed the street, Leroux Street. And then they get to San Diego at the end of the Sitgreaves expedition. And there he receives a message that his services were needed by the new border survey, and to kind of hang loose. And so he did. And the next big thing is that Bartlett showed up in San Diego, getting ready to head to El Paso to continue the border surveys. And so it was a month or so later that I think the next slide shows this. Whipple and Gray were a couple of his key guys. And Whipple and Gray both arrived on January 10th. Now, see, Leroux had been in San Diego since mid-December. And then Bartlett arrived finally on February 9th, but immediately went to San Francisco, which he was kind of wont to do, get off the subject. He was always going somewhere else, allegedly to get supplies. And he didn't return until late April, when he actually hired Leroux and his arrieros, the mule drivers, to lead the border commission, and they departed San Diego on May 26th. So Leroux had been in San Diego for almost 6 months at this point, waiting for this to start. And so I'm going to skip all the border survey except this one statement from Bartlett's report. And they had got to Tucson. They're in Mexican territory because it's before the Gadsden Purchase. And they went down to Tubac. And then they were on the way from Tubac to Tumacacre, and the wagon broke down, and that's another story. And then the next day, they got to Calabasas, which is Rio Rico of today, and Bartlett wrote this. This Calabasa, I was told by Leroux, was a thriving establishment when he visited it 20 years ago. A large tract of land was then under cultivation, the herd of cattle were rare, And here is a drawing by A.B. Gray of the Calabasas buildings, which are still there. And the Park Service has, Rick is the next speaker, and he's a park ranger from that division of the Park Service, and he could tell you about that if he has time. But the point that the reason I put this in here is because of this statement. When he visited it 20 years ago. Remember what he was doing from the late 1820s? He said, for 15 years I trapped all of the rivers in Arizona. So when he said he was here 20 years ago, I don't know if that was 19 years or 18 or 21 years or actually 20 years ago. But 20 years would have been 1832, right in the middle of the time when he was trapping in Arizona. Okay, the next thing, the next one slide that I have is not him as a guide, but it is he then went. The next thing, Bartlett finally got into El Paso. Leroux went back up to Taos, and then turned around almost immediately, I believe at the request of Senator Thomas Hart Benton of St. Louis, to go do some lobbying in Washington. And so Leroux went to Washington. I wish that we had a diary that showed that he was probably traveling by himself, and he didn't keep diaries except for his very last expedition. He kept a little diary. So here we are. He shows up in Washington, D.C., and I think he just presented a written report. I don't think he addressed Congress, but he gave a written report. That was the one that was being quoted in the newspaper, the New York Times, that we started out with a while ago. And he was recommending the central route through Cochetopa Pass in Colorado. A little bit more on that in a minute. And then he comes back. And on the way back, he's back from Washington to St. Louis. And he starts heading on the Santa Fe Trail to head to Taos. And guess what? There were some American wagon train and immigrants on the trail. And guess what they did? They hired him to guide them across. So he's leading these immigrants now. And a day or two or three into that, up pulls Edward F. Beale with the U.S. military and says, I want to hire you. And he says, well, you know, I'm with these immigrants here, and there's a couple of rough spots on the trail up ahead. Let me stay with them another 3 days, and then I'll catch up to you. You go on, and I'll catch up to you, and then I'll work for you. Okay, so they made a deal, the Beale expedition. This was all on May 20th, 1853. So in the next day or so, what happened is, it says here, May 20th, we overtook Leroux on his way to Taos, considered ourselves fortunate in securing the services of so experienced a guy. He does not join us at once, seeking his train safely over 1 or 2 bad places, but promised to overtake us in a day or two. May 22, Leroux joined the expedition with the intent of remaining with us. May 24, Mr. Leroux came suddenly ill with a pleurisy attack. And they took him on to Fort Atchison and left him under a surgeon's care there. And they continued forward, but the plan was for Leroux to catch up to them after he recovered from the pleurisy. And Leroux did, in fact, recover quickly and went rapidly to Taos, missing the Beale group. And then the Beale group came into Taos some days later and found Leroux there in good health. but it all fell apart because time was running out, and Leroux already had a contract with Whipple to lead a different group. And so he did one day with the Beale expedition, somewhere out there on the Santa Fe Trail. So that's not one of the major ones. Now, what's the time? Does anybody know what time it is?
10:35.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. Next big expedition, Gunnison Beckwith. And the reason Beckwith's name is on there, he was kind of second in charge, is because Gunnison got killed and Beckwith wrote the report. And so they were, Leroux had reported that there's not much snow in this pass in Colorado. Well, listen, I lived there 11 years in southwest Colorado, in Durango, and there's a lot of snow in every pass that I know of. And in fact, many of the passes in the summer, it never melts. And there's snow year-round, or you can certainly be snowed on year-round in any of the passes. And so just north of Taos is the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado. And to the west there is the San Juan Mountains around Durango. And to the north there are other mountain ranges. And on the north side of those mountains is what we know today as the Gunnison River. And there is a pass up there. It's actually east of Creede, Colorado. That is one of the lowest passes in Colorado. I mean, these others I'm talking about around Durango are typically around 13,000 feet or so, the passes, with the surrounding mountains up around 14,000 feet. But that's not the case with the Cochetopa Pass. By the way, Cochetopa was an Indian name for the pass where a buffalo came through. Here's actually, it's 10,000 feet, which is significantly lower than 13,000 feet when it comes to snow. And it's a broad, open, flat area with no real steep mountains around it. There's a little cliff on one side, not very big. I got this oldest photograph I could find, which if you know much about cars, you can probably figure out the year that this was taken. But this is the Cochetopa Pass that he was helping Gunnison through. And so they make it through that pass here, and here's the Gunnison River here, and way off of the slide over here is where the La Plata Mountains are around Durango that I'm more familiar with. So on September 18th, Leroux went ahead of the Gunnison group. This is the way he operated. The scout would go out with one or two people usually, and then maybe send a messenger back, and they would find the places to camp and to look for water. On September 22, he returned to the Gunnison camp and shared route details. This is 4 days. This is right at the end of the expedition, because on this one also Gunnison was double booked. I mean, Leroux was double booked. He agreed to help Gunnison to get into Utah, but he said, I have another contract and I have to get back to Taos by a certain date. So they knew that from the beginning, and those days were approaching, and actually September 23, that year is the day that he had to leave to go back to Taos. So what he did is he went ahead for 4 days to scout out the trail that he remembered into Utah, west of Grand Junction, Colorado, and came back, and in the camp that night he described all of the details, and a map was drawn up. Now, whether it was Gunnison who drew the map, or maybe even Beckwith, or maybe even Leroux himself, because he was the one who just explored it for 4 days, it was him that was supplying the information. So, before Leroux left us, he had given us an exact description of the locale in which we were to reach the Spanish Trail, following across the Grand River. The Grand River is what we call the Gunnison River today. It connects in Utah with the Green River to become the Colorado. Now, the Colorado River was renamed, and part of this now is called the Colorado River Colorado, so it gets a little confusing. But here's the map they drew in that camp that night. And this map was found in the National Archives by David Miller, and he shared it with me, and it describes in detail where they were going to go over the next 4 days to about in here. But then there are many more days on the map into southwest Utah. And that obviously was from previous memory and previous trips he'd been on. And so he proved to be invaluable to the Gunnison expedition about this. Unfortunately, as they moved on into Utah and Leroux returned to Taos, some Indians attacked and Gunnison was killed. So this is another one of the major expeditions, at any rate, that he led. And you can see here's the Green River and here's the Sevier River, and you can look those up on the map and see where we're at in Utah. Here is where the Gunnison River runs into what was called the Grand at the time. It's the Colorado now. And this is in the town of Grand Junction. And so the word Grand Junction is not a really big place where things cross. It is named for the Grand River, okay, which ran through that town. And there was a junction with the Gunnison River there. So, now, the next expedition they had to get back to Taos to go on, another big one, was the Whipple expedition, railroad survey on the 35th parallel, the same route that he went with Sitgreaves earlier. So he's an experienced guide now because he's been there. And Leroux was the chief guide, and a couple of the science officers was guys named Tidball and Mulhausen, and they both kept diaries and drawings. And so I want to show you a little bit of this. This is, by the way, at the University of Arizona Special Collections, this book here is Whipple's presentation copy to Tidball of the report of that trip. And why that's important to me is because Tidball left some pretty good, interesting drawings. We'll look at them in just a second. So Whipple had written to Leroux from Washington in advance. That's why he had to leave the Gunnison expedition, and he had agreed to do this. And so here's the route from Santa Fe through Zuni, same exact as Sitgreaves, into the Mojave Village, and then through the Mojave Desert. But see, Leroux had been many times through the Old Spanish Trail, which goes up this way and down and into the same way to get to San Bernardino. So he was pretty experienced on this whole trip, having been there before. This is a key thing I wanted to read to you, because this is what Leroux said about, this is what Tidball said about Leroux the guide. He was rather under, description here, he was rather under the standard size. For every ounce of him was a genuine man. His muscles were unencumbered by fat, his wiry form in a manner indicative of the endurance required of one pursuing his mode of life. Swarthy of complexion, with straight black hair and clear black eyes, he showed in his whole makeup a man equal to the occasion. His native language was the Spanish of New Mexico. Not true, it was French, okay? St. Louis, but his broken English was quite intelligible. He, however, talked but little and never boastingly of himself. He was no swashbuckler cowboy, but a genuine mountaineer of a pair with Kit Carson. The nature of the mountain ranges and what lay beyond them appeared to be well known to him, as though he could see through their rocky diaphragms. That's what Tidball said about how Leroux could look off at those mountains and know right where the water was. And this is what I wanted to read to you, is how he found the water. Water was the great desideration. Stop. I had to look it up in the dictionary. It says the wish to have something desired. The wish to have something desired. That's desideration. Water was the great desideration. Finding these holes was Leroux's great art. From an eminence he would gaze long and steadily at the dreary prospect before him, a prospect that generally gave but little hope of water for ourselves and our thirsty animals. Presently, he would say in his quiet way, there is the water. Someone would say, where? And he would say, there at the foot of that butte. But which butte would be asked? There being a multitude of buttes. He would indicate by giving his hand a horizontal swing of a quarter of a circle, taking in a scope of country, often greater in extent than the state of Delaware, mostly of jagged mountains, which if they had been flattened could have covered more than the area of Pennsylvania. This was his method of pointing. He never aimed directly at the mark with his fingers as others do, but a sweep of the hand. A few more questions, however, he would fit the attention to the exact spot, which generally proved to be a gigantic cliff of basaltic rock appearing at such great distance as a mere speck against the mountainside. Many tedious hours would be consumed in toiling over and winding around spurs of mountains to reach the indicated spot, but we never failed to find the water. According to Tidball, a clump of small cottonwood trees was a never-failing sign of water in this region. At that season of the year, they were leafless and difficult to see at a distance, but Leroux's practiced eye always proved more keen than our field glasses. So that's why they were hiring him, to do this work for them. And then Leroux made this drawing. And it says, Tidball. Lieutenant John Tidball made this drawing on this trip. Leroux, I regret that I have no sketch of him more worthy. But there's Leroux on his mule, which he always used to mule. Now, there are some photographs of Leroux. We know this because a historian in the early 20th century interviewed Leroux's daughters, and one of them said she had some photographs and he was going to go get them, and apparently that never happened. And I've never seen a legitimate photograph of Leroux that had some provenance that we know for sure that's who it was. He returned to the Whipple expedition. He returned from the Whipple expedition to New Mexico via the Gila and Pima villages, but went up to the Salt River and the Rio Verde to the Little Colorado back towards Zuni. Later maps calling this route the Leroux Trail. He kept a journal on this trip. Only a brief excerpt has been preserved, and I'm not going to take the time to go into it because it's 3 or 4 pages long. Now, finally, one of his final expeditions is the Loring-Marcy expedition in relief of Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston's Mormon war troops at Fort Bridger in 1858. They got up there in the Grand Junction area, and that's where Fort Bridger is, somewhere around there, and got into a really bad winter and were running out of supplies. So they sent Marcy, who was with them, to, let me get back here. They sent Marcy with him over the mountains to New Mexico for help between November and mid-January through the central Colorado mountains. And it appears that he did go backwards through Cochetopa Pass. And then they, with the folks at Fort Union, they put together 1,000 animals, and then Loring and Marcy went up the Front Range, the eastern Colorado, that's a Colorado term, the Front Range, from Fort Union to Rayado in early March, and then Loring left a little later, and Marcy was in Colorado Springs in the area. They finally got all the way around through Colorado to Fort Bridger on June the 9th with the relief supplies. So it took quite a while to get help. And then Leroux returned to Taos via Cochetopa Pass in the summer of 1859. This is where they left from Fort Union, and this is where they went to Fort Bridger on the Green River, just into Utah. And here's some scenes that were published in Harper's Weekly of that winter that they were waiting for the supplies to get there. It must have been a rough winter. and while taking the animals up to them through the snowstorm. It says here, a train on the plains in Colorado on the way there. Okay, and then the final one is John Van Duzen Dubois, scouting for Comanches and Kiowas. This is a highly successful operation. They left on September 9th. Leroux was the chief guide, 59 years old. They headed towards the Santa Fe Trail. Back in the area of Mrs. White the Point of Rocks area is where they were headed to in a separate incident. And they captured 2 Mexican horse thieves with 30 stolen horses, but they didn't find any Comanches and they didn't find any Kiowas that they were looking for, and they went back. And then, the next year, Leroux died. So I put that a gray slide on June 30th, 1861. He died of asthma complicated by spear wounds. Now, that was probably the arrow injuries that he got on the Sitgreaves expedition in western Arizona. He was 60 years old. He was at his hacienda between the Placito de los Luceros and the Ranchita de Arriba, which are 2 little local spots just north of Taos. And he was buried August 1, husband of Juana Vigil, in the nave of the parish church. And no one had been buried in the church for 15 years, so they were giving him a high honor. But the church burned and then was bulldozed for a new one in 1960, and they found some old bones, but they thought that were just the priest's bones and stuff, so it was probably included Leroux's. And then 3 months later, 1754, a Spanish grant, there weren't very many of them, was given to the Vigil family, and Juana Caterina, a daughter or granddaughter, a descendant, was Leroux's wife. And so what used to be called the Vigil grant became the Leroux grant, and the Surveyor General approved the petition after working out a deal with the Taos Indians on October 5th, 1861, 3 months after Leroux died. It was ultimately approved by Congress in 1869, and at one point in the Spanish version it was 500,000 acres, and the American approved size was 56,000 acres, and that's it. That covers 12 expeditions, 5 major ones. And you see that he got all over everywhere. He covered every trail that we're talking about that we could even begin to call a southern trail, including the ones in northern Arizona and including the Spanish, Old Spanish Trail and all of that Colorado-Utah stuff. Thank you very much.